I'm going to share my screen right now, and I'm going to walk you through essentially period 4, and I'm trying to give you a better idea of what are these big stories, what are important to know about them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that might come up on the day of the AP exam. So period 4 is from 1800 to 1848, and the things that kind of frame period 4 are the election of 1800 at the beginning. That's where the beginnings of Jeffersonian democracy. That's when, say, the Federalist Party leaves office peacefully and Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans come into office. And then the end of this time period is 1848, which is defined by the Seneca Falls Convention, which is one of the last big reform movements that takes place. And it is also like the culmination of some of the reform movements that happened during this period and the start of first wave feminism. So this is what I guess the endpoints are for period 4. And in between, a lot of important stuff is happening, like a lot of important stuff that you need to know. Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy, the market revolution, the War of 1812. There's so much going on, so we're going to try to like piece this stuff together because it really is crucial to understanding this era, but also crucial to understanding period 5 because it sets the stage for all of that. So let's talk a little bit about our first story, story 1. What do I want you to know about story 1? So when we get into the first story, don't just say nationalism. Story 1 is about understanding that when we talk about nationalism, America's coming together in a few key ways. Nationalism is about uniting as a country and feeling a connection with one another, pride in one's country. Well, there's 3 things that are kind of connecting Americans and bringing those Americans together. The first thing is that America is growing during this time period, but actually physically growing. So the United States is actually adding territory, but it also is having a large number of Americans move further west into that territory. So at the very beginning of this time period, we've got the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubles the size of the United States and makes America a much larger country. And of course, that is something that makes a lot of Americans proud. In addition to that, there's also the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 was fought primarily over like neutrality on the high seas, and we wanted to reaffirm our independence from Great Britain. But there was also an element of the War of 1812 that was about westward expansion. And if you remember right, the War Hawks, which included Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, they wanted to essentially free Western lands up from Native Americans for American expansion. And there was a lot of people that believed that the British were occupying forts on the western frontier and that they were supplying Native Americans with weapons to essentially attack American settlements. And so there was part of the War of 1812 was to free up these western lands so that Americans can continue to march westward. After the War of 1812, there's continued purchases of land, like the Florida Purchase, which is done through the Adams-O'Neill Treaty in 1819. And then there's the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is super important to foreign affairs, but it also assumes American dominance of the Western Hemisphere. So the Monroe Doctrine says that America will be the protectors of the Western Hemisphere. That the United States will control the Western Hemisphere and that European countries should not colonize this area and that they should stay out of our part of the world. That's kind of this growing feeling of nationalism and assumption that America is the dominant power in this part of the world. That is further confirmed in the years following the War of 1812, where we start to see the ideas of manifest destiny starting to develop. Americans are moving westward, and they're starting to believe that it is their destiny, that God wants Americans to expand from the East Coast to the West Coast. And we really start to see those ideas beginning at this time period, but then starting to really take shape in the 1840s, like when we start to claim Texas, fight the Mexican-American War, and so on and so forth. Okay, so all of this is part of that increased nationalism. There's other things that are going on, though, that is also leading to nationalism. One thing you absolutely have to know, this is one of the most critical things to be aware of for period 4, is that it's during this time period that America starts to build a national economy. When we talk about the growth of a national economy, we're also sometimes referring to what we call the market revolution. Now, what is the market revolution? What makes it so important to this time period? Well, it's a complete overhaul of our economy in the sense that prior to this time period, all of our different states were, they had economies, obviously. People produced stuff, but it was all regional. People only produced enough for themselves and for their local area. There wasn't a lot of trade that was connecting different parts of the country. Okay, and so what we start to see during this time period is that America, as big as it is starting to link up in new ways that it never linked up before. So this begins because of new technologies and especially improved transportation. So new technologies like the steamboat is going to allow for faster transportation from one area of the country to the next. All of a sudden now ships don't have to travel with the current. They can travel upstream, upriver. You no longer have to worry about sailing ships and worry about whether or not they have wind. The steam engines are powering these ships to allow them to travel like further and faster. We also see canals. There's a huge a number of canals that are built in the 1810s and the 1820s that are connecting new parts of the country. So the best example of this is the Erie Canal, which links up New York to the Great Lakes and all the way to Chicago. So for the first time now, goods can be traded from New York to Chicago rather quickly. Prior to this time period, if I'm a farmer and I want to sell my goods to New York and I lived in Illinois, I would have to ship all my goods down the Mississippi River, unload them in New Orleans, and then have them sail from New Orleans all the way around Florida up to New York. And that was actually faster and cheaper than shipping them over land. And so it wasn't very easy for people to trade outside of their region, so they didn't do it very much. Now that transportation is becoming I guess, improved, and we see that with like even the beginnings of the railroad by the 1820s, people are able to create surpluses. And that's what the market revolution is about. The market revolution is about people going from just producing enough for themselves to producing surpluses. In other words, more than they need to sell in distant markets. So if I'm a farmer in Illinois, I'm going to produce more corn than just I need to feed my family. I'm going to produce as much corn as I can to maybe ship to New York and sell for a larger price. And so that's what the market revolution is. It's the growth of markets and a national market and a national economy. Now, as the market revolution takes hold, each part of our country is developing different things. So, for example, the New England area, the North, becomes a leader in industry in America after the War of 1812. The Embargo Act and the War of 1812 cut us off from trade with England. And so we start to see the first factories building up in and really starting to grow to a large extent in the 1800s and the 1810s. The best example of that is the Lowell Mills, which were established in 1811. The factories during this time period are very different than the factories that we talk about later in history. First of all, they're run by water. And second of all, they produce almost exclusively textiles. So they're making like cloth. Now, where are they getting the raw material for that cloth? That's where the South comes in. The South specializes in cotton during this time period. They start to grow cotton in larger numbers, and then they sell some of that cotton to the North to produce in turn into textiles. The West, which is our third region, is becoming a major agricultural area that is producing lots and lots of food. So you've got new technology like the steel plow and the McCormick mechanical reaper that's allowing them to harvest more and more crops, and they're growing wheat and corn to feed the rest of the country. So each of these regions is specializing, but they're trading their goods with the other regions in order to create a national economy. You have to understand this concept. The market revolution is not only, if you get a period 4 question, going to be a likely part of it, but it's also going to be an important contextualization for so much that happens in the early 1800s. Now, there's even a political system that's designed to kind of create a national economy during this time period, and that's Henry Clay's American system, which advocates for a new national bank, the second national bank of the United States. It advocates for protective tariffs. And finally, it advocates for internal improvements like roads to try to connect the regions even further. Now, the last part of this first story is political nationalism. And it's important to understand that in addition to like the growth of like our territory, in addition to the fact that our economy is becoming linked, we also start to see our politics becoming more nationally minded. And what I mean by that is in the after the War of 1812, we start to see the elimination of the Federalist Party, and we have this era where there's one party that's connecting everyone. And that's the era of good feelings. It is short-lived. I'd like to point this out. This idea of political nationalism does not last very long, but for a small window of time under James Monroe, there's only one political party, and on the surface, at least, it looks like there's national unity. During this era of political national unity, it is important to know that there is a lot of cultural unity as well. So there's like paintings that are happening during this time period that are glorifying America's past. There's the establishment of an Dictionary of American English by Noah Webster, not Daniel Webster, Noah Webster. And there is also things like the Star-Spangled Banner that are being created during this time period. The national unity, though, is short-lived, and under the surface is brewing kind of our next story, and that is the idea of sectionalism. Now, this is kind of confusing for students because how is sectionalism and nationalism occurring at the exact same time? Well, nationalism is probably more predominant at the beginning of the time period, but over the course of period 4, sectionalism is going to grow and grow and grow and kind of lead us towards period 5 and the Civil War. And it's important to know that even as America seems like it's coming together economically, even though it seems to be united under expansion, even though we kind of experience this era of good feelings, under the surface, there are growing issues that are dividing Americans by region and also by their constitutional views. And I want to go through those one at a time. So when we talk about increased sectionalism, we're talking about sectionalism is this idea of favoring what's best for your region or your section of the country over the good of the country as a whole. And we start to see this during this time period. A lot of it stems from the fact that at the same time we're creating a national economy, each part of the country is specializing in something different. And as they specialize in different things, they're going to want different things from the federal government. A good example of this is the South. The South is probably the most distinct region of the 3 areas that I talked about. And they're the most distinct because of the fact that, number one, they're almost completely agricultural based. In 1793, you've got the cotton gin being created, and what that does is it means that cotton can be grown and produced for large profits. And so the South kind of latches onto that as their main source of making an income. And cotton becomes king. King cotton is grown throughout parts of the Deep South. But in order to grow that cotton, Southerners increasingly start to believe that they need slaves to pick the cotton and to essentially like grow the cotton on what becomes these large plantations. And so at the same time that cotton's growing, we have slavery growing. And it's only in the South that we see like slavery rapidly expanding. And it's expanding like in unison with the growth of cotton during this time period. Now, the South is a very large and powerful region. And so there's this growing divide in this country between politically the power of slave states, which are making up like the South, and then like the free states, which are made up of the North and primarily the Northwest, because if you think back all the way to the Northwest Ordinance, slavery had been banned in the Northwest Territory under the Articles of Confederation. So America's divided between slave states in the South and free states in the North, and that leads to tension. Now, probably the best example of these tensions is the Missouri Compromise, and the tension over admitting Missouri as a slave state in around 1820. So Missouri wants to enter into the United States, and they want to enter in as a slave state, which is really controversial because it would, I guess, undo the balance of free states and slave states during this time period, leaving more slave states than free states in our Congress. And that's a big deal for fear that, there are different needs for the southern regions versus, say, the areas of the north and the west. And so what ends up happening is there's a standoff within our Congress over the admission of Missouri. That standoff is ended with the Missouri Compromise, which was proposed by Henry Clay. And Henry Clay pretty much allows Missouri to enter in as a slave state, but in order to keep the balance, Maine is admitted as a free state. And then what ends up happening is they draw a line down across the country that becomes known as the Missouri Compromise line along the 3430 parallel. And what it essentially says is that anything north of that line is going to become a free state. Anything south of that line is going to be a slave state. So we're literally drawing a line, and that is the definition of sectionalism. We're drawing this line saying this part of our country is different than this part up here. This tension will further grow in the 1830s as slavery starts to be viewed as evil by a growing abolitionist movement in the North. And with William Lloyd Garrison in the 1830s and abolitionism becoming even more widespread, the South is going to react to that by taking a further stance on slavery, saying that they absolutely need slavery and that slavery is a positive good. That's John C. Calhoun makes that argument, that slavery is not only economically necessary, but that the Southerners are bettering their slaves, further causing tension between the North and South, which we'll see leading us into the Civil War. Now, another major point of sectionalism and tension is this debate over states' rights and who has more power, the federal government or the state. Now, the federal government obviously is going to be growing in power after the ratification of the Constitution. But there's a lot of states that are concerned and want to retain as many rights as they possibly can. And we see this kind of issue boil up over the course of period 4. So during the build up to the War of 1812, for example, there is a huge argument between the New England area and the rest of the country because the Embargo Act cuts them off from trade with Great Britain and parts of Europe, which they see as necessary to supporting themselves. During the War of 1812, that trade is cut off again. And so they see the federal government as denying their ability to make a living for themselves. And so they convene the Hartford Convention, which discusses constitutional issues and even potentially talks about secession. After the War of 1812, there's another constitutional crisis that starts in 1828. There's something called the Tariff of Abominations that is passed in 1828, in which there's a huge tariff that is put on imported goods coming in from Europe. That tariff was supposed to protect American industry, but because the South doesn't produce a lot, they're highly opposed to that tariff. And South Carolina argues that a state should have the right to nullify laws if it's in their best interest, and therefore arguing that the state is more powerful than the federal government. That crisis is solved eventually by a compromise that's reached, but Andrew Jackson almost actually sends the military into South Carolina during that crisis. So there's these tensions that are emerging over states' rights. The last one is tensions over immigration. And immigration is another controversial issue because we've got a flow of immigrants that are coming in after the War of 1812. And specifically, the two groups that are coming in the highest numbers are the Irish Catholics that are coming because of the Irish potato famine, and then Germans that are coming because of the German Revolution. Irish are settling primarily in the East, and Germans are settling primarily in the West. Almost none of them are settling in the South. But as immigrants come over, we're going to see tensions over nativism. There's debate over whether or not America should be for people that were born here, or whether it should be for all people that want to come to this country. Now, the last story that I want to cover And I'm running out of time, so I want to do this as quickly as I can. Story 3, super important, and that is this idea of increased political participation and reform. Throughout this entire time period, America is starting to see an expansion of democracy. It's also seeing an increased participation in who is involved in our political system. So there are 3 major parts of the story that you absolutely need to know. Jeffersonian democracy at the beginning of this time period, Jacksonian democracy starting in the 1820s, 1830s, and then the rise of reform movements that happened also in the 1830s after the Second Great Awakening. You need to know those 3 stories because they help tell this idea of political participation. So let's go through them one at a time. Jeffersonian democracy begins in 1800 when Jefferson takes office, and Jeffersonian democracy is all about the small yeoman farmer. So Jefferson he wants to promote the idea of the small farmer over, say, like what he sees as elitist businesses. As a result, he also wants to protect more liberties. He wants to expand westward, and he also would like to see more power to the states over the federal government. These are the ideas of Jeffersonian democracy, and we see them carried out to varying degrees of success under Jefferson's presidency. So there's the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubles the size of the United States, and that's important because now there's more land for farmers to move to and settle in, and it kind of promotes this idea of America as an agricultural society. The Embargo Act, where we cut off trade with England, was to protect our neutrality, but Jefferson wasn't worried about it because he valued self-sufficient farmers. And so those businesses and traders that were hurt by it wouldn't be a big deal because in his mind, our society should be built around agriculture. And then the War of 1812, which happens under James Madison, but still a member of this idea of Jeffersonian democracy, once again is about maintaining neutrality, even if it cuts us off from trade or industry. But it's about protecting westward expansion, it's about protecting our neutrality, and it's about creating an agricultural society. Now, here's the thing about Jeffersonian democracy. Not everything that he did actually promoted what he wanted. So Louisiana Purchase, yes, adds more land for like farming, but at the same time, it also increases the power of the president. Remember, Jefferson almost didn't go through with the Louisiana Purchase because he didn't know if he had the constitutional right to do it. The Embargo Act and the War of 1812 were possible in Jefferson's mind because he saw America as agricultural and self-sufficient. But one of the side effects of the Embargo Act and the War of 1812 was that it led to a growth of manufacturing here in the United States and really the start of the market revolution. So, Jefferson is a contradiction because not everything that he's trying to accomplish gets accomplished, but you have to understand his vision. And his vision is to create a agricultural society where the average property owner can participate. That moves us into Jacksonian democracy and the era of the common man. Know that. Jackson is all about the era of the common man. Now, what makes this the era of the common man? Well, after the War of 1812, there is an expansion in who can participate in our democratic system. We see that with the universal white male suffrage. So they eliminate the property requirement for voting in America, and that allows more people to participate. This is super important because a lot of people are confused by what's the difference between Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy. Jackson also believes in states' rights. He also he supports agriculture over business. He's also advocating against elitists. But the difference is that Jefferson would have never, ever, ever wanted people without property to vote. Jackson goes a step further and says, I don't care if you're rich, I don't care if you're poor, I don't care if you have land or not. Everyone should be able to participate in our democratic system if you're a white male. And while that doesn't seem very democratic to us today, it was more democratic than it had been up until this point because of those voting requirements that saw property as necessary for voting up until this time period. Now, Jackson, when he takes into office, does a bunch of things to try to promote the common man. He creates the spoils system, and the spoils system is he gives jobs in the government to his friends because he says anyone can do these jobs. It's not a big deal. You don't have to be super well educated or wealthy in order to be able to run the government. He destroys the Bank of the United States, the Second National Bank of the United States, because he sees it as an elitist organization that hurts the poor or common man. And so that's another example of him kind of promoting these ideas. The Trail of Tears is another example of his view of the common man. The state of Georgia wanted the Cherokee removed from Georgia and moved west. Jackson sided with the state over the Supreme Court. And so in his mind, he was doing what was in the interest of the state and in the interest of the common man. And so all of these things are part of this idea of Jacksonian democracy. He didn't go as far as disunion. One note, kind of side note, is that during the nullification crisis, he did not side with South Carolina because he thought the idea of nullifying laws and secession was too far. But Jackson favored states' rights and the common man up to the point of disunion. And you need to know Jackson. He's a super important figure. The last important concept is the growth of reform movements during this time period. And there's the Second Great Awakening, which is this religious revival that kind of emphasizes morality, reemphasizes religion in society. It's occurring in the 1820s for the most part. And what it does is it makes people start to kind of think differently about their world and about themselves. They start to look around at the society. They look around at changes that are happening because of, say, the market revolution. And they start to ask themselves, how can we fix our world to make it more moral and to make it better? And so it leads to the growth of all these different reform movements in society that become really, really important, and you have to know them. The most important reform movements, the big three, are number one, the abolitionist movement, which I have highlighted here in red. And that is the change from thinking about slavery as an economic issue to a moral issue. People start to view slavery as morally wrong, and you've got radical abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass who are calling for an end to slavery immediately without any kind of compensation to slave owners in the South. This terrifies Southerners, and as well as obviously rebellions that are happening that also terrify Southerners who own these slaves. Nat Turner's rebellion is a great example of that. Now that's probably one of the most important reform movements. Other reform movements that are important and worth knowing, though, there's the temperance movement, which is the movement to make our society more moral by banning alcohol. Well, we see that with the American Temperance Society, which is happening during this time period. There's also the Washingtonians and other groups of people that are happening that are promoting this anti-alcohol movement. There's also a women's rights movement that's happening during this time period as women want to have more rights for themselves. Before this time period, there had been Republican motherhood. And then at the start of this time period, at the beginning of the market revolution, there's the growth of the cult of domesticity, which say that women belong in the home. And women began to push back against that. And they start to fight for their own movement, which becomes known as the first wave feminism, which is kicked off with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Now, there's other reforms that are worth knowing. There's the push for public education in the form of Horace Mann. There is the asylum movement, which wants to create institutions to try to fix people who have been neglected in society, whether it's criminals or whether it's the blind or the deaf. There is a movement to build more self-reliance. You've got, for example, the transcendentalists like Emerson and Brook Farm, who want America to become more self-reliant and are responding to the market revolution. So all these are reform movements that are getting people more involved in our political system. But it is important to note that even though democracy is expanding, it's limited. There's still a lot of people that aren't being included. Slavery still exists in the South, and African Americans are being denied the right to vote. Women are still not given any kind of political rights. You've got Native Americans who are viewed as outsiders in our system and don't have a lot of protections legally. You have immigrants that are coming into the country and are facing a backlash in the form of nativism. So there are a lot, even though democracy is expanding, there are limitations that we have to note as well. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up period 4. Make sure you know this period. It's super important because it leads us directly into period 5. Cannot understand period 5 without understanding period 4.